Once again, we'd like to turn to John, 9th chapter. Before we read our text, the theme of the Gospel of John is the deity of Jesus Christ. The function of John's Gospel is stated in John chapter 20, if we turn there. John 20, verses 30 and 31. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written, the ones that John recorded, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. In John's Gospel, through the lens of John, of course, we see Jesus demonstrating his deity. We see his person is illustrated all through John's Gospel. And as you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see Jesus interacting with the people. In doing so, he's declaring, he's demonstrating who he is, making pronouncement about his identity. And in John chapter 21, verse 25, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. The miracles of Christ were God designed to authenticate the mission of Christ, to promote and strengthen our faith. They portray the needs of man and the salvation and the sufficiency that is in Jesus Christ. These miracles are a reminder of his being, his character, his attributes, his power, his purpose. And his miracles link him to us and to our needs. The miracles of Christ reveal that he is the magnificent one, that he is the incomparable one. Again, they are a revelation of God's provision and remedy for man. They reveal to us that he is the answer. The miracles of Christ are acts of love on his part, acts of grace and mercy, revealing to us the absolute sovereignty and dominion and preeminence of Jesus Christ and the providing, transforming power of Christ. The miracles of Christ are actual and significant events. They are of great variety. They occur in everyday life. And we see in each one Jesus meeting specific needs in the lives of individuals. This afternoon, again, we'd like to read in John. We'll begin at chapter 8, verse 58, and read through verse 11 of John 9. Jesus said unto them, that is, the Pharisees, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was I am. Then took they up stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself, made himself invisible, and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. So he's left the temple. And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me. While it is day, the night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground, made clay of the spittle. He anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way therefore and washed, and came seeing. The neighbors therefore, and they which before had seen him that he was blind, said, Is not this he that sat and begged? Some said, This is he. Others said, He's like him. But he said, I am he. Therefore said they unto him, How were thine eyes opened? He answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay, anointed mine eyes, and said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. Again, here in John chapter 9, we have the privilege of beholding one of these countless miracles of Christ. By way of background, we see in John chapter 8 that Jesus is in the temple. We see from John 8 verse 2, And early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. In doing so, he declared many wonderful truths concerning himself. And these truths infuriated the Pharisees. And in verse 58, he says to them in a very clear and unmistakable way, Before Abraham was, I am. And then in verse 59, we see so infuriated at what they saw as blasphemy, they took up stones to cast at him. But Jesus made himself invisible and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them. Walked right through the midst of them. They couldn't see him. So he's left the temple. He's outside of the temple. Verse 1, chapter 9, he saw a man. Probably at the gate, probably at one of the temple gates. And this man was blind from his birth. And as we said in the previous message, Jesus sees him from head to foot, inside and out. Sees him as no one else can. He sees him with eyes of tenderness and love and grace. In verse 2, his disciples, who no doubt followed him out of the temple, asked him a question concerning this man that was born blind. Their question was based upon their own erroneous assumptions and conclusions. In verse 3, Jesus, again, their question in verse 2 is, who did sin that this man is blind? Their assumption is that because something is wrong with this man, that either he sinned or his parents sinned to cause this blindness. In verse 3, Jesus informs them, and this is a lesson we need to learn and learn it well, that not all disease, not all defect and suffering come as a result of personal sin. And that the purpose of this man's defect was that the works of God should be made manifest in him. That's the reason this man was born blind. In other words, this man was born blind for this day that Jesus passed by. In verse 4, Jesus makes a statement, and it serves both as an introduction and an explanation of what he was about to do concerning this blind man. He was about to do the works of him that sent me. So what Jesus did in healing this man was the very work of God. And then in verse 5, Jesus makes a statement about himself, I am the light of the world. And again, as we said earlier, the light is what this blind man needed. So what Jesus is saying here is, I am what this man needs. I am, talking to his disciples, I am what this man needs. He is telling them, regardless of their assumptions, their conclusions, he was what this man so desperately needed. And that brings us to verse 6 and 7, where we have the record of Jesus healing this blind man. And again, the entire chapter centers around this miraculous healing, with most of the chapter given to the discussion that took place concerning this miracle. In this message, we want to center our thoughts upon the man's initial response to the question of the people. How were thine eyes opened? And in verse 11, his response, a man that is called Jesus. He that was sightless, but now with seeing eyes, he is saying it was Jesus. You ask how I see, and I am telling you it was Jesus. He is saying Jesus is the reason that I have gone from blindness to seeing. It was Jesus. And that is our subject. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. Consider the healing of this man. Again in verse 4, Jesus declares he came to do the works of God. Jesus Christ left the adorations of heaven, came to the abominations of earth to do the works of God. Came from the majesties of heaven to the miseries of earth, from the praises of heaven to the persecutions of earth, to do the works of God. And that is what he does in our text. He is doing the works of God. So consider the condition of this man. Verse 1, he was blind. Again, as we showed in the previous message, his blindness is confirmed throughout the entire chapter. 12 times we're told that he was blind. 5 times that he was blind from birth. So his condition is one of darkness. Throughout the Word of God, darkness is used to represent sin, represent evil and wickedness and corruption, guilt and error and ignorance, sorrow, misery. That which is satanic. And it is used to illustrate death. Darkness is used to represent the state of the unregenerate. We see that in 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 4 and 5. The state of darkness is illustrated throughout the Word of God, and it draws a picture of the condition of the unsaved sinner. In Romans 2, verse 19, we read, which are in darkness. In darkness. That's true of every unsaved sinner. In Luke 1, verse 79, we read of them that sit in darkness. They're in darkness and they're sitting in darkness. That means they're settled in darkness. In John 12:35, ye that walketh in darkness. That is, they live in darkness. Matthew 6:23, we read of those full of darkness. Full of darkness. They're in darkness, they sit in darkness, they walk in darkness, they're full of darkness. Ephesians 5 verse 8, for ye were sometimes darkness. That is darkness itself. You're not only in darkness, you're in it so long and to such a degree you become darkness. In John 1 verse 5, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. So blind that they cannot see the light that shines in darkness. All of those verses describe you and I in our unsaved condition. And if you are here and unsaved, it describes you now. Now this man which was blind, and he was so from birth. So the only thing he ever knew was darkness. That's all he knew. And no doubt, he became accustomed to the darkness. He became accustomed to the difficulties that are associated with it. And his life is greatly impaired by his blindness. In addition to being blind, as we said this morning, he was also a beggar. Verse 8, he sat and begged. So his life is a life of destitution. Jesus comes to where this man is. Jesus came out of the temple. I believe he left the temple at that time for this man. He knew where he was. And there sits this blind man in the blindness of darkness, in the destitution of poverty. We need to see him there. We need to get a picture of this man sitting there. He is a man who desperately needs a miracle. There isn't a one of us here that do not stand in need of some miracles. This man was in desperate need of a miracle. But he was content in his blindness because he knows no other way of life. So there he is, in the darkness, begging, just an ordinary day in his life. But then come those wonderful words, Jesus passed by. And he did so on purpose. And he did so with a purpose. And the purpose is stated in verse 3, that the works of God should be made manifest in him. And in verse 4, the works of him that sent me. Jesus, the one who is greater than all, the one in whom there is no condition, no situation, no circumstance, no enslavement, no problem, no difficulty, no trial, no disease, no plague, no wound, no affliction, no need that he is not the answer for. Jesus came to where this man was sitting. It is declared in verse 1, he saw this man. Again, he did so in a very special way. He saw his condition, knew all about this man's condition, that he was blind from birth. So Jesus sees this man in his darkness. He sees this man in his poverty. Jesus is the light, and He has come to where this man is. He has come to this man's place of darkness. The man does not see Jesus. He can't. Nor does he know Him. But Jesus saw and knew him. And Jesus was there to transform this man's life. Again, as Jesus passed by, He saw a man blind from his birth. From verse 2, and this would be another message, there's a valuable lesson here. The disciples are looking at the same man that Jesus was. And this led to a conversation about this man's condition. The disciples, seeing this blind man sitting there begging, they want to discuss the man's condition. May I say, no amount of discussion is going to help this man. No amount of discussion is going to help this man. They want to know who sinned, leading this man to his blindness. But Jesus was there, not to discuss the man's condition, but to bring the man from his condition. Jesus wasn't there to discuss the man's darkness. He wasn't there to discuss the reason. It didn't matter. He was there to bring the man from his darkness. Oh, God's people are good at discussing a lot of things. And in all their discussions, it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Doesn't change a thing. But aren't you glad that Jesus came to where we are, not to discuss our condition, but to bring us out of our condition? And we read in verse 6 that Jesus spat on the ground. He then, no doubt, got down, because it says he made clay of the spittle. So he had to get down to ground level. Again, picture the man is sitting. So now Jesus is down to this man's level. And then it says that he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. The blind man could not see what Jesus was doing. But don't tell me that this blind man couldn't feel the touch of Jesus' hands upon his sightless eyes. And oh, what that man felt at this time. So Jesus is touching the man's eyes with this clay. And then Jesus demands a response of faith from this man. Verse 7, he says, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." And then notice what it says in verse 7. He went his way, that is the blind man. Therefore, because Jesus told him to. That's all you need. You don't need anything else. And he went his way, therefore, because Jesus told him to. And he washed. And then it says, and came seeing. Came where? Came back to where Jesus was. This man who had lived his entire life in darkness is blind no more. Blind no more. A change has taken place. And the change was recognized. Again, remember what it says, that the works of God should be made manifest in him. And the change was manifest. Notice verse 8. They which had before seen him, that he was blind. These ask in astonishment amongst themselves, is not this he that sat and begged? Obviously, they could tell the man sees. He can see. They can tell because he's walking different. I mean, you walk different than if you can see and you can't. They could see everything about him was different. The implication is, again, is not this he that sat and begged? They are implying, the implication is he's no longer begging. He didn't just go and take his seat on the curb or whatever it was and continue begging. His life had been changed. He had been brought from darkness, and because of that, his manner of living was different. That's what happens in salvation. Every single time. Every single time. And then notice, there's an argument concerning him, verse 9. Some said, this is he. They said, I know it's him. I know it's him. Others said, no, he looks like him. But he said, I'm he. I'm the one. I'm the one who sat here in my darkness and begged. I'm he. I'm the one who lived in darkness. I'm the one who begged, and I'm the one whose life was in bondage to blindness. I am the one you knew as blind. So the change from blindness to sight is confirmed 15 times, one way or another, throughout the chapter. Notice, is confirmed in a general way. Verse 7. He came seeing. Verse 13. Aforetime was blind. That is, he used to be blind. Verse 14. And it was on the Sabbath day when Jesus opened his eyes. In verse 18. Him that had received sight. In verse 32, opened the eyes of one that was born blind. Now the man's neighbors confirmed also. They asked him in verse 10, how were thine eyes opened? And the blind man himself confirmed. Verse 11, he said, I received sight. In verse 15, I do wash and do see. Or I washed and do see. In verse 25, I was blind, now I see. In verse 30, he hath opened mine eyes. The man's parents, they also confirm, verse 21, by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. The Pharisees confirm this man's healing by asking the man's parents in verse 19, how then doth he now see? And in verse 15, by their questions to the blind man, how he had received his sight. Verse 17, what sayest thou of him that he hath opened thine eyes? And verse 26, how opened he thine eyes? So it is confirmed over and over and over that this man had gone from a state of blindness to blind no more. Over and over. And it's manifest. The Scriptures leave no doubt that the man who had lived his entire life in darkness, he now sees. And again, remember verse 3. Jesus came to this blind man that the works of God should be made manifest in him. This man testifies of Jesus. Those who knew him in verse 10 again asked in absolute astonishment, "How were thine eyes opened?" They're asking, "What happened to you? Just a few moments ago you were blind. Tell us how you can now see. What brought this about?" And the man responds with great excitement and passion. And the very first words out of his mouth, "A man that is called Jesus." That's the first words out of his mouth. So what's on his mind? More than the fact that he could see, what was on his mind is this man that is called Jesus. That's the first thing out of his mouth. A man that is called Jesus. And then notice what he goes on to say. He says, a man that is called Jesus. And notice the verbs here in verse 11. A man that is called Jesus made clay. He's telling us what? He's telling us what Jesus did. A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. He did something to me personally. And he said to me personally. So we have made, anointed, and said. He said to me, "Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. Wash the clay from his eyes." And I went and I washed, and I received sight. He is saying, you ask me how it is that I went from blindness to seeing. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. This man knew that it was not of himself, that he was blind no more. This man knew that it wasn't due to whatever money he collected that day, that he was blind no more. He didn't just collect enough money one day and go to a good eye doctor. Well, it didn't have anything to do with the money that he collected that day. This man knew that it was not due to religion or any formula of man that he was blind no more. This man knew that it was not the pool of Siloam that he was blind no more. This man now, he can see and he knows it was Jesus. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. Look at this man. He was blind, but now he sees. There is no natural explanation. There is no medical explanation. There is no psychological explanation. The only explanation is the one the man gave. It was Jesus, a man that is called Jesus. At this very moment, Jesus was the most important one to him. That was the most important matter in this man's life. He knew that it was Jesus. There was not room for anything else. It was Jesus. So let's look at this man who's been healed, and let's look at him and Jesus. He has gone from being a blind beggar and not knowing who Jesus was to seeing and realizing it was Jesus. In verse 13, those who knew this man, following the healed man's declaration that it was Jesus who caused his blindness to go away, they bring him to the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day. And the Pharisees questioned him in verse 15. And again the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. And he reiterates what Jesus had done. And notice what he says. He said unto them, the Pharisees, He didn't begin the testimony with himself. He put clay upon mine eyes. That's where he began. He. That's where our salvation experience began. And then in verse 16, they speak in a derogatory way of Jesus in this man's hearing. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God. Same Pharisees that had just listened to what Jesus had to say in the temple, in John 8. Because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. And then in verse 17, they asked this man who had received sight, what sayest thou of him? And notice what he says. He said he's a prophet. He says, I know this. He's sent from God. He's sent from God. He doesn't know much about Jesus at this point. But he knows he's of God. That he does know. He realizes that Jesus is no ordinary man. The Pharisees, verse 18 and 19, began to doubt, I'm not so sure this man ever was blind. And notice verse 18, but the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him that had received the sight, and they asked them, saying, is this your son who ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? So the Pharisees are now questioning the parents. The parents respond. Verse 20 and verse 21. His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son. Remember, there were some saying, oh, this isn't even him. He just looks like him. Mom and Dad say, no, we know this is our son. And we know he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. But he's of age. Ask him. He shall speak for himself. So they again called this blind man, probably into the temple, verse 24. Then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, give God the praise. We know that this man, Jesus Christ, is a sinner. So they accused Jesus of being a sinner. And again, this man, he doesn't know much about him. Doesn't know much about Jesus. He does know that he gave him sight. And he does know and believe that he's from God. And then in verse 25, he answered and said, whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. But one thing I do know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. I know one thing. I was blind. Now I see. He knows I know that. You all can discuss all the other things you want, but I know this. I was blind and now I see, is what he's telling them. He's saying, I know for certain that it was Jesus that transformed my life. Now notice there in verse 25, I was blind. Was, past tense. Now I see, present tense. So he is now no longer what he was. And why is that? It was Jesus. It was Jesus. And everyone that the Lord saves, you are now what you were not before. And the reason, it was Jesus. So you see, this man's now has been changed. And it was Jesus. They ask in verse 26, what did he do to thee? How opened he thine eyes? Notice verse 27. He answered them, I've told you already. I've already told you that. And ye did not hear. Wherefore would ye hear it again? He's catching on to these Pharisees. Will ye also be his disciples? What's he saying? He's saying, I'm his disciple. Will ye also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, thou art his disciple. But we are Moses' disciples. Knowing it was Jesus, he became a follower of Christ. When you know with absolute certainty that it was Jesus, you will be his disciple. When you know with absolute certainty that it was Jesus, you will be willing to leave all for him. In verse 30, he repeats, he hath opened mine eyes. 2 words. He hath. Read them over and over and over again. He hath. He hath. He hath. He hath. I had nothing to do with it. He hath opened my eyes. He knew that it was Jesus. And in verse 34, they cast him out of the temple. And so it is today. The religious world cannot tolerate it was Jesus. They can't tolerate it. It does not fit into their theological system. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. It was Jesus that saved our soul. Baptism had nothing to do with it. Good works had nothing to do with it. Church membership had nothing to do with it. It was Jesus. And the religious world is still struggling with that truth today. And so it was with these Pharisees, so they cast him out. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, so Jesus goes to this man. There they are together again. And in verse 36 and 37, this one who had opened his eyes and transformed his life reveals himself more fully to him. Verse 36 or verse 35, Jesus says, dost thou believe on the Son of God? He answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. Jesus is further revealing Himself to this man. And that's what Jesus does when He saves a soul. He doesn't just save you and then leave you, but He'll further reveal Himself to you. And notice the man's response. And he said, Lord. And he said, Lord. The man recognizes that this man that is called Jesus, is Lord. That is, He's worthy of all. And then notice what it says. I believe. And he worshiped Him. He has a vivid realization what Jesus has done for him. And what does he do? He bows before Him in reverential awe of mind and body, exalting, honoring, and praising Him. That's what you do when you worship. And he does so with a humbled heart and a thankful spirit. That's what worship is. And an overflowing love for Him. This is what you'll do when you know that it was Jesus. You will recognize Him as Lord, and you will worship. We that are saved, we were sinful rebels against God. We were deserving to be consumed by God. We were guilty before God. We were afar off from God. We were alienated from God. We are under the condemnation of God. And we lived our lives in the filth of sin, enslaved and entangled in sin. And we were in darkness, and we were bankrupt before God. And we were totally, entirely unacceptable to God. Living our lives for ourselves, living life for self-gratification, wandering aimlessly according to the course of this world, having no ability whatsoever to free ourselves. We were hopelessly lost, and we were on our way to an eternity away from God. But a man that is called Jesus came to where we were. Why? That the works of God should be made manifest in us. And this man that is called Jesus, He lifted and rescued us from the power of darkness and from the dominion of Satan and from our unrighteous, bankrupt, lost, spiritually dead state. And when you know that it was Jesus that came to you, you will follow and you will worship Him. When you know, when you can look back and see what you were in your unsaved condition and see what you are now in your saved condition and know that it was Jesus who made the difference, your heart will overflow with a desire to follow Him, to worship Him. And when you know it was Jesus, you will want to serve Him. You will want to glorify Him. If you profess salvation and you don't want these things, you need to go back to the day when He came to you. And you need to get settled in your heart and mind that it was Jesus. And you won't have a problem serving Him. You'll want to serve Him. When you know that it was Jesus, you will realize that He was worthy of all. And He is to be put above all. Mom and Dad did not bring me from my unsaved condition to my saved condition. It was Jesus. Aunts and uncles and cousins did not bring me from that condition. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. Don't ever forget that. It was Jesus. And you realize He's worthy of all. And the truth is, I don't have enough adoration. I do not have enough praise or thanksgiving to give to this one who is called Jesus. This man became His disciple, became a disciple of Christ. His life was now marked by a man that is called Jesus. Our life needs to be marked by a man that is called Jesus. A man that is called Jesus made a difference in my life. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. Let that be known to all. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. It's all because of Jesus. He's the reason for the difference. That's why we sing. There is a name I love to hear. I love to sing its worth. It sounds like music in mine ear, the sweetest name on earth. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because He first loved me. It was Jesus. Knowing this, how attracted am I to Him? How captivated am I by Him? To what degree am I drawn to Him? It was Jesus. I ought to be drawn to Him. He ought to be a magnet, pulling me in His direction. What influence does He have in my life? So when this man said, a man that is called Jesus, basically what he was saying was, it was Jesus. It was Jesus. You and I that are saved, it was Jesus. Don't ever forget that. Don't ever get away from that. It was Jesus. Well, I'm not going to serve the Lord anymore because brother so-and-so did this, sister so-and-so did this, the church did this. It was Jesus. None of that other stuff matters. None of that matters. If you know it was Jesus. That's all you need to know. It was Jesus. We do not give the glory, we do not give the praise, we do not give the credit to anyone else. It was Jesus. Do you know that today? And let me tell you this, if you're here and unsaved, if you're ever going to be saved, it'll be because it was Jesus. There is no other way. If one day you find yourself in glory, I believe that's what everybody will be saying. It was Jesus. It was Jesus. And that's why throughout Revelation you see them singing to who? Christ. Because everyone there knows it's all because of Him. It was Jesus. Song leader, come and lead us verse of song. Let's all stand.